Hello and welcome everybody to another interview in our series Real World Open Source Software, where we talk to the founders of commercial open source companies that are built on top of Prisma. Today, I'm speaking with Mark Zeitz, founder of Papermark. Papermark is a DocSend alternative where users can share documents with others, whether these documents are local PDF files or live Notion pages. Once a document was shared, users can get notifications, statistics, and feedback from the viewers who opened it. And here is a fun side story. Mark has called himself Prisma User Zero. And we not only talked about the history and evolution of Prisma as a product and a company, but of course also why he picked Prisma for building Papermark, how he picked the entire tech stack for the application, and why he made it open source. In the interview, we also discussed the recent introduction of joins for relation queries in Prisma and how that made a lot of Mark's database queries a lot more performant. And now, without further ado, let me bring you Mark Zeitz. Welcome, Mark Zeitz, founder of Papermark, to the show. It's great to have you on. Mark, can you please introduce yourself and tell us what's your background? How did you come to build an open source commercial company in the first place?
Really, I've been, grateful because I've been in software for more than 10 years now, and building software really allows me to work from anywhere, and that's been my goal for a really long time. Originally, I was studying finance and physics, so something completely different. But I really wanted to build something real, so I kind of taught myself how to program, like so many of my fellow developers.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about Papermark. Can you tell us what it is and how you came up with the idea for it?
Yeah, absolutely. So Papermark is an open source DocSend alternative. In essence, you can share any document with a link and get real-time engagement analytics from your viewers. So I'm a data guy and I love analytics, and documents are just such a core of everyone's work. Yet we know really little about how these documents are consumed, right? There's a lot of tools that are great at creating documents, from Microsoft Office to Google Docs to Notion nowadays. But none of these tools really give you the deep analytics throughout the cycle of a document. So, let alone having them talk to one another, it's a nightmare. So Papermark is building a platform to make document analytics accessible to everyone. Mm-hmm. And, we're starting kind of like as this DocSend alternative, but our vision is really to build if you want, an observability layer for documents, no matter where they live.
When you're talking about documents, are you specifically referring to PDF files, or is it that, like, as you mentioned Notion, you mentioned Google Docs, I can just grab the Notion link from any document inside of my Notion workspace and it'll work equally well with that?
Yeah, so we started off with PDFs because they're just so a great universal document file format. However, of course, we know that there's more than just PDFs. One of the most requested features from actually our community and customers was to include sharing Notion through Papermark. So that's what we launched most recently. So that, like you said, you can grab any Notion link and put it behind a Papermark link. So that gives you everything from custom domains to an email wall, password wall, and obviously engagement analytics. Mm-hmm. And pretty soon we'll be adding more document types as well.
How did you pick the technology stack for Papermark?
Yeah, so as an open source project from the get-go, we want to be as inclusive to as many contributors as possible. So for us, it was really important that the technology stack that we choose was, stable, well-documented, and tried and true tooling. And so in a nutshell, we started with Next.js as kind of like our framework on top of React, TypeScript, because, you're going to be working with a lot of other developers on this, and you don't want to trust in, everything that everyone writes, especially,
Yeah, like the TypeScript compiler is your best teammate in that regard.
100%. And then, of course, Prisma and Postgres, I think, the latter two. Postgres has been my database since the very beginning. I can't imagine myself switching to MySQL, even though PlanetScale tries to make it really hard to make me switch. But I've never wavered on my ORM, and so Prisma has always been kind of like my data access layer.
I see. You also mentioned that Papermark, it's obviously open source. That's why we're doing this interview with you, and people can just go and check out the repo by themselves, can even contribute to the application. Why did you build Papermark as an open source application?
Yeah, well, for one, open source has been really, core to my philosophy. And, I've been in open source since the beginning of my programming career. So I owe everything to open source, from, being a, small contributor to big projects to pushing out a lot of projects myself. And so for me, it was natural to, open up Papermark from the very beginning in order to also give back to the ecosystem. I think it's a great learning experience also for first-time contributors or developers that are just starting out to kind of like pick an open source project that's not exactly just a library or some backend functionality, but a really end-to-end application that you can use, that you can feel, that you can touch. And so I think that was like one of the core decisions, just to go with open source from the beginning.
I see. So people can essentially go take the repo and deploy it themselves, and they'll have their own version of Papermark running on their own system. But I think you're also offering this, of course, as a hosted product and essentially as a software as a service product where people like me can just go and sign up without the need to deploy that. Is that the right way to think about this?
Yeah, that's 100% correct. So we are fully open source under the AGPL version 3 license, and anyone can kind of like fork the repo, contribute to it, make their own changes, and then publish it under the same license as it's kind of like requested from this license. And then on our end, of course, we want to create an application and have a hosted version of Papermark just to show what it's capable of, and kind of like give that service to or provide that service to other users who might not be technically apt or just don't want to go through the struggle of hosting it themselves, but still value that it's open source and by itself, so that they can, for example, look up the code, jump into issues. If they find something that isn't working, they can open an issue, open a discussion item. And I think just that layer of support that you have with an open source project versus if we were a closed software as a service, it's just like unparalleled. So even our customers love that we're open source because they feel like they have much more access to the projects, to its roadmap, and where it's going.
Nice. And speaking of the hosting, what hosting providers have you chosen for your hosted version of the SaaS product?
Yeah, so we're hosted on Vercel, and that was just a natural beginning for us using Next.js. I know that it's obviously possible to host Next.js, on any other kind of servers, but it just makes it really easy for us, especially in the beginning, to choose Vercel as a hosting partner.
Nice. How have you come across Prisma for the very first time? And I think there is an origin story here that people might be interested in from a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it's when I was thinking about this. So I would say I'm Prisma user 0, and it all started with GraphQool. I mean, obviously the team is Prisma user 0, but 0.1 then. No, it started with GraphQool in February 2016, and I had to look back at the times actually, because GraphQool was officially announced in March of 2016, but we had like a preview version that we were working with Johannes at the time, and we needed a really powerful system in order to build a live tracker for Twitter for the UEFA Champions League finale and the subsequent 2016 World Cup. Essentially, what Twitter wanted at the time was have each match kind of like in one website for each match with the live scores, and whenever there's let's say someone scores a goal, they would highlight certain like tweets from the Twitter graph. That was back in the day when there was still the fire hose where we had access to all the Twitter graph, and it was a great time. And that was pretty much my first project with with GraphQL and through GraphQL. And yeah, it's been such a fun journey at the time. And yeah, the days of GraphQL were amazing. So there were many other projects that followed. And then obviously with Prisma, the first version was like our go-to tooling. Back in the day, it was like called the database access layer or data access layer. So we used it for everything, but obviously the tooling was still a bit. GraphQL gave you this hosted platform, which was everything in one, and Prisma tried to break up these individual components and give you a bit more control as a developer, and we like that. But I think you really hit the nail with the Prisma 2 release, which now everyone just calls Prisma.
The Prisma
just
ORM,
because
exactly.
Yeah, because it's just a full ORM. It's extremely flexible, but still, the query language is beautiful. Tooling such as JSON protocol and most recently relation joins, really welcome addition to speed up the performance of my database and my Prisma queries. So it's been fantastic.
That's great to hear. And I always really enjoy talking to people that have been around in our community for longer. And I mean, you're a really special case there because you indeed were in touch with our founders back in the day when GraphQL was just conceived. And by the way, for everybody who is watching this and has no idea what we're talking about with GraphQL, you can type in graph.cool in your browser and you'll find kind of the sunset notice and the announcement of how we transitioned as a company from being called GraphQL to Prisma and what that meant for our technology stack. And we'll also put that in the description of this video. And yeah, I always really enjoy it because I've been around for now almost 7 years in the company as well. So it's great to talk to people that kind of have been around for the entire transition, the product transitions that we've done over time. All right, you touched on this already a little bit, but I'm still curious. How has your experience been with Prisma in general? And then I'm always interested, like, what are the tricky situations that you maybe needed to resolve with Prisma? Because, of course, Prisma in the end is an abstraction over your database. And while it probably caters to the majority of use cases that people have for working with a database, I assume that there always are some cases where it's difficult for Prisma to actually meet the needs of the developer, like the 10, 20% where you maybe need an escape hatch or need to figure out a tricky workaround. Did you come across any situations like that?
Well, probably in my journey throughout, from GraphQL to Prisma, 100%. But I would say, like, since starting Papermark and obviously, kind of like inheriting all this great experience so far that went into Prisma, into the ORM. There are really two things that stood out. One of them is Prisma Migrate. It kind of takes me back to those, Ruby on Rails days where, you just type Rails DB migrate, and it's such a bliss that that abstraction just works, and like it's so great. Early on, when you start a project, you typically don't really think about migrations because it's typically you working on that project and you just kind of like DB push to update the schema on your remote DB. And that definitely hit me as well because, it wasn't until there were the first contributors who were kind of like asking, okay, where are the migrations? Like, how do I run this? Like, I want to add something to the database, for this and this feature. And then one contributor actually added the migrations, and it was a fun day to kind of like, okay, how do I actually manage to, have my existing database, which at that time then already had, a bunch of users on the hosted version. So I didn't want, to. It's quite scary, when you run, Prisma Migrate or Prisma DB Push. I mean, I'm not doing that anymore, but it's scary, when it says, oh, you might lose your entire database. So it's great that there's a warning, but it's still super scary for developers. Yeah, so really Prisma Migrate diff from empty was like, is your friend. And, Prisma has a really great documentation on this about how you can add migrations later on to an existing project. And that really helped, that specific, documentation to kind of like create all the migrations up to that point as a, one big migration of the database. And then obviously Prisma Migrate Resolve Applied was a godsend, just to get that into my database. And other than that, I like that, Prisma doesn't intrude into my database too much. So, it reserves one table for the migrations, and that's about it. Everything else is, my regular Postgres database as I would provision it, with any other tool. And so I really like that, because that also makes then moving from one, either migrating the database from one provider to another really easy, because it's just as easy as copying essentially the individual tables and data. But yeah, that was the first thing. Prisma Migrate. What a great addition. And it's been around for a while now.
Exactly. I think one of the key learnings when we were building Prisma One, this GraphQL proxy server that sat on top of your database and turned your database into a GraphQL API, we kind of had two key learnings. And one was the learning that what people really enjoy is just to define their schema using GraphQL SDL, because it's such an intuitive language to define data structures. And the second learning was that it was really nice that they could talk to their database using GraphQL, or then with the TypeScript bindings that we created for GraphQL. And then we took these learnings and kind of rethought what Prisma should be if it's not this proxy server, but if it really just solved these two core problems. And that's how we came up with the Prisma ORM that enabled to use or to benefit of the same, to take advantage of the same benefits as before, but just by using it as an NPM library, just running NPM install instead of needing to set up this entire proxy server. And yeah, it's great to see that this also resonated with you. And I can also totally relate to the workflows that you described. Kind of, you start off with your project, you just run Prisma DB push for as long as it works, or as long as you can afford it. But then, of course, once you start collaborating with other people, that's where you really need migration, right? Where everybody kind of needs to be able to track the history of changes that were made against the database. So that's indeed where Prisma Migrate comes into play. And it's nice to hear that our documentation has helped you there to kind of introduce these migrations later on. All of that is really great to hear.
Yeah, no, 100%. And the other thing, that's just a recent addition, but kind of like historically the application and kind of like the data structure for Papermark grew in a way that, as a user or as a viewer, you only have a link. And from that link, we derive everything that the document contains. So any kind of permissions are all related to the link, the document itself, or better yet, the document version because we also allow the user to upload different versions so that the link doesn't change. So we also need to take that into account. And then because we provide page-by-page analytics, we also have a kind of document pages model where we save or where we store each individual page of a document. Typically for PDFs or pitch decks, for example, they have maybe, let's say, 10 pages or so. And so we can quickly get to a very deeply nested query from link to all the way to document pages. That's kind of like 3 layers deep, if you want. And yeah, that was sometimes the performance would suffer if they were not really well optimized queries. And relation joins, which was just added recently in 5.7, really helped kind of like, get that natural join table in my SQL, in my raw SQL, and it's been great. I can see the literal performance from before and after. I've been meaning to write something about that, but yeah, it's been really great. I also, of course, like try to make the queries not so deeply nested. I think 3 layers is a bit hardcore. Any database will suffer there, but yeah, it's been really great to see that addition as well, and see in general kind of like adding these different features to Prisma, kind of like as a preview, and then kind of like making them generally available once they're really proven and all the edge cases are kind of taken care of. And I can see that going forward really with Prisma at that speed, and yeah, it's been great.
Awesome. Mark, you have made me really curious about Papermark. So what do you say we jump into a demo, and you maybe first can show me what the app actually looks like, and then we can also dive into the code base a little bit and you walk me through that.
Yeah, let's do that. So
Perfect.
this is, let me just jump back here. I've got a local instance here of Papermark, and I've only got one document in here at the moment. But basically, it's it's very simple. It's kind of like how you would imagine. If you use DocSend, for example, it might look familiar. You add a document. There's kind of like 2 versions, whether you upload a document or you add a Notion page, and that's just a link to Notion. Here are all your documents, and then you've got settings, of course, about your team. You can have multiple teams as well, invite team members so that you have kind of like create that multiplayer experience. We can jump into kind of like our detail view of the document. In this case, what we can see straight away is kind of like our page by page like view duration, and this is the average view duration across all visitors. At the moment, I only have 1 visitor, which was I earlier, and I get like multiple links that all point to the same document, and I can get a new link. We can also add custom domains here. I haven't configured one yet, but you can add a custom domain with a custom ending, essentially. You can disable requiring to view the document. You can add a password protection. You can add an expiration date. You can turn off or turn on email notifications on a per link basis as well. Sometimes it's nice to receive a lot of emails, but sometimes it also gets annoying. So we heard that feedback from our users, and we kind of like gave them an option to turn this off. So this is what your viewer essentially would see here. If they would go to, let's imagine this local host is papermark.io. This is what this link would look like if you're kind of like on the out of the box version. Right now, I only have an email request here. Once you click, it kind of like, you saw that how quickly it worked. Obviously, this is localhost, but also the relation query definitely helped, because all we have to go on here is the link ID, really, or this ID for this view. Nothing else is being sent to the browser before you actually confirm that you want to view this. This is to protect, obviously, the users who have uploaded the documents. So we don't want to send too much through the network requests.
One quick question. What you just showed me was the experience as a visitor, right? So it was me who received the link. I ended up on that screen where I needed to provide my email address, and then I just click go, and then the document is being loaded. And the person who uploaded the document, the actual kind of Papermark user, that will then, if they turned it on, receive the email notification for that. But for sure, their stats are going to go up about the visitors, the number of visits to that document, as we see here now. Yes.
Yeah, you're right. So you can see here last viewed 1 minute ago, and this is kind of like the first time the person viewed it, not when the person leaves the document. So this is really real time, and we can see we kind of viewed 50% of the document so far.
Wow.
This is the information I get as a uploader and sharing the document. So I can see most time for that person was spent on the first page. And, as you can, I just clicked through, the first 4 pages of 8. And, as we kind of like look at all the pages, we can really see kind of like the entire graph kind of like populate. This is for this viewer, and here the average view duration is also updated, and we can leave kind of like reactions as well. There's kind of like a nice gimmick that we added to launch week, because we thought it would be great to have direct feedback on a per page basis, and so that's what we liked about it. And that's pretty much the core experience of Papermark. And get a link, view the document, and as a recipient, as a sender, you get all the feedback from that document. And so full transparency.
Great. Let's maybe jump into the code base, if that's okay, and take a look at how the application is structured, what your data model looks like, and then maybe also, I'm always curious to follow like a request from the front end to the database and just understand what's the life cycle of a request that's flowing through the application.
Right now, the repo is not a mono repo or not a turbo repo, as so many are. It actually still uses the pages directory from Next.js by default. I chose this because I think the pages directory is it's obviously been around the longest, and most of the developers coming to the project, they will be familiar with pages. The pages directory, so it's going to be easy for them to add to the project doing this. But there will certainly be a time where the project has to grow, so it's going to be inevitable to move to a turbo repo, mono repo, or whatever. But yeah, essentially we've got our pages with our API. We've got the most interesting kind of like views are really the view page for domains and for individual links. So like I said, you can add a custom domain, and based on the custom domain, they typically have a domain and a slug, let's say, docs.prisma.io/presentation, and that would redirect to here, and I've got a middleware that handles the redirect to a different domain. And we can jump into here, and that kind of rewrites the current path. So this is this all happens on Vercel in the query. This rewrites the path to view domain and then the host and the path, so that we can actually consume it. At the same time, this is kind of like the more standard approach, right? Where you have the view link ID. This is what I showed just now. And we can make this a bit smaller. And this is by default, it's a static page. It gets all the properties kind of like at build time, or then obviously how get static props works with React. It will build if it doesn't exist on the first request, when there is, for example, a new link. And we can see here we have the different link properties, and we have the Notion data as well, in case it's a Notion link. We get all this data from kind of like our API/links, and this is kind of lives API links, and then the ID of the link. And it's a GET request, and right here is kind of like what I also talked about. It's our first nested query. That's why I also have a timing wrapper around this, just because I'm just curious how long it actually takes in production and obviously in development. But yeah, we're going down here. We're getting all the, checking whether there's an email wall and a password wall, whether it's already archived, the link, or whether it's expired. Then at the same time, we're grabbing the document, and from the document, we're grabbing the versions. So we're going two layers into the model. I'm not going 3 layers into version and into pages. That would be a bit too much. But basically, based on the versions, we're getting the latest version, which is the primary version. If the user uploads 2 or 3 versions, for example, this will be helpful. And then, that's pretty much it. Returns the link to the front end and creates really quickly that page to view it. What happens here is kind of like in the view, we are, like I said, I want to send as minimal data as possible to the client before the user is not requesting it. So we have this this new component called document view, because we're sharing this across the custom domains and the non-custom domains, the Papermark domains. And essentially what happened here when I clicked request or continue with my domain, with my email, we're sending a request to the API/views, and I can just open that up right here. And I'm sending really just basic link information data to this endpoint. And right here, I'm kind of like destructuring everything. So I'm finding my link ID. I'm getting all that information, checking server side whether I actually allow the user to view this or not. And then once the user has entered the right password, entered the correct email, etc., then I'm creating a view in the database, which actually records at the time kind of like who viewed it, which document, which link. And then I'm getting kind of like my individual pages. And you can see I'm timing each of these as well, because they used to be very deeply nested queries, as I mentioned before, but I'm getting the document pages based on the version ID, so that I actually don't have to go too many, like just one, don't have to go 2 layers down. I can just directly query the model.
And it's super interesting you're timing all of these queries. And as you mentioned before that you thought about like writing maybe a blog article about this, I think that would be a super interesting read actually for a lot of people in the Prisma community to also learn like what's the actual impact of the joins that we're introducing. And I think that these joins, they also especially shine on deeply nested queries, like when you really have like a lot of queries. But yeah, it's interesting, and I hope that you find the time to write this.
Yeah, no, I definitely will. And in the end, kind of like what I'm returning to the client is a minimal object that just contains the minimal information that I need to really present. So in this case, we're just view recorded message, the view ID, and the pages. In this case, pages will be an array of, let's say I think in Papermark demo, I had like 10 pages. So this will be the 10 pages, kind of like just the what we extracted here, just the file URL and the page number, so that we can display it correctly. And that's pretty much it, that the client consumes all of this. This has been greatly improved by Prisma, and I think it would not be so easy to kind of structure it if the Prisma queries weren't so intuitive. So it definitely helped me, and also all the contributors to kind of understand what's happening here, and and just make this really large kind of like serverless function work flawlessly.
And here is the Prisma schema that you're using for the application. And I think here what I'm spotting is the account, the session, and the user models. And I think that's coming from Next.auth, right? Are you using Next.auth in
correct.
Your application?
Yeah, that's correct. I'm using Next.auth for all the authentication. We've built authentication with Magic Link, Google, LinkedIn, and passkeys. So really everything that you want to authenticate with. And yeah, Next.auth makes it like super easy. And the Prisma adapter has also been, I don't know, it just works. Like I didn't have to think about it. So that's been a really great experience.
And yeah, we've got our user of your domain kind of. I think it's probably the document, and then I see some collaborative models, probably like the team, user team.
Yeah, I would say the document and the link are central, and they're all connected to the team in the end. So we added actually after the fact, so it wasn't a team scoped application since day one. It was everything connected to just a single user. So there was also a fun addition to add teams, but it was important because we knew that something as essential as kind of like working on different documents, you needed a team. You wanted to work with your with your colleague on this. So yeah, document is definitely central. We have different files. And like I said, we started adding document versions also later on. So document versions are connected to the document itself. And then they themselves have pages, individual pages, since we moved to the page model. Before we had just kind of like one URL, one file that we would render with the PDFs. We used React PDF to render them in the browser, but it didn't perform well on really large documents. So we knew we wanted to separate them out into individual pages. And so we're doing a bit of magic. When you upload a document, let's say you upload a PDF, we actually splice the PDF up into individual pages and convert them to images. That's how images are just much more native to the web than PDFs or any other kind of documents. So it makes them really much more versatile and easy to render in the browser. We can scale them up and down. And yeah, so that was why we have this document page model. And then we've got our link, which contains everything from when it expires, if there's a password, an allow, kind of like an allow list and deny list, whether the email, there's an email wall, whether we allow downloading, and all the views are connected here. We have domains because we allow users to upload multiple domains. And then this is really the view. All the engagement data that you saw, we're actually using Tinybird for this. So we're not storing it in our Postgres just because I think it would just bloat our Postgres too much. So we're rather opting for Tinybird, which is a kind of like a ClickHouse, a hosted ClickHouse database, and really good for this kind of use case. But it works really well together with Prisma. So I've been really happy about that. Yeah, you've got some enums because we do send system emails, such as your domain is expired or your domain is invalid. DNS records aren't set. Also, then for payments, we send some reminders. That's why we have this kind of like send email model here. And then conversations is something that we added when we introduced document assistant, so an AI-based kind of like chat with your document. And this is the conversation model. So very slim here, because most of it is handled by OpenAI. Yeah.
That sounds great. Mark, that was a great overview over your open source app, Papermark. And thank you so much for coming on the show and talking to me today.
Thanks so much, Nico. It was a great pleasure, and talk soon.